It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind of calm that hinted at storms brewing just beneath the surface. Aisha Collins had spent her day blending into the background, the way she always did. Her cover was simple, a single mother working long hours at a neighborhood diner. To most people, she was just another face in the crowd, juggling bills, raising a young son, and keeping her head down. But Aisha had secrets, and those secrets were buried so deep that even the closest scrutiny couldn't uncover the truth. For Aisha Collins was no ordinary woman. She was a highly trained CIA operative, stationed undercover to dismantle a network of corrupt officials in the very city she called home. That night, as she locked up her modest apartment and checked on her son, Jamal, she had no idea her quiet existence was about to be shattered. Aisha lived for precision and control, but life often had other plans. A small patrol car idled across the street from her building, a sight she'd grown accustomed to over the months. Cops were always present in her neighborhood, but their presence felt less protective and more predatory. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the environment she'd chosen for her mission. Inside that patrol car sat Officer Rick Stevens and his partner, Mark Tanner. Stevens had been on the force for over a decade, a man who believed he'd seen it all. Tanner was younger, eager to prove himself, and willing to follow Stevens' lead, no matter how murky the waters became. They weren't just cops on patrol, they were men on a mission, though not one rooted in justice. Tonight, they were looking for a scapegoat, someone to pin a crime on, someone vulnerable and defenseless. As Aisha stepped out of her apartment, her senses tingled. She wasn't just any woman, she was trained to detect danger before it struck. The idle car didn't sit right with her, but she didn't show it. Years of espionage had taught her to remain calm under pressure. She made her way to the corner store, her movements deliberate yet unremarkable. She didn't notice Stevens and Tanner exchange a look or the way the engine growled to life as they trailed her from a distance. Inside the store, Aisha exchanged pleasantries with the cashier, a young man named Malik, who always greeted her with a warm smile. She grabbed a carton of milk and a few snacks for Jamal before heading to the counter. The moment she stepped back outside, the air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made her pulse quicken. The patrol car was now parked directly in front of the store, and Stevens and Tanner were getting out. "Ma'am," Stevens called, his tone firm but falsely polite. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." Aisha's first instinct was to assess her surroundings. The street was quiet, save for a couple of onlookers who quickly averted their gaze. She nodded, feigning ignorance. "Sure, officers. What's this about?" Tanner held up a small bag filled with a white substance. "This was found near your apartment building. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" Her stomach clenched, but she forced herself to smile. "I wouldn't. I've been in my apartment all evening, except for just now." Stevens stepped closer, his presence looming. "We have reports of suspicious activity. You match the description." Aisha knew exactly where this was going. She'd seen it before: false accusations, fabricated evidence, and an abuse of power designed to ruin lives. But this time, they'd picked the wrong target. Still, she couldn't blow her cover. Not yet. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm happy to cooperate, but I assure you I have nothing to do with this." A calm demeanor seemed to irritate Stevens. "We'll see about that. Turn around, hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked, cold metal biting into her wrists. Aisha caught the eyes of Malik, who stood frozen in the store doorway. He looked like he wanted to speak up but was too scared. She gave him a supple shake of her head. This wasn't the time. As they loaded her into the back of the car, her mind raced. She had no doubt the evidence against her would be flimsy but damaging enough to stick if she didn't act carefully. But Aisha wasn't just a woman with everything to lose. She was a woman with everything to fight for. By the time they arrived at the station, Aisha had a plan brewing. She'd play their game, let them think they had the upper hand. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and she intended to keep it that way until the moment it mattered most. As they processed her, Stevens and Tanner exchanged smug looks, confident they'd just closed another case. But Aisha knew the truth was far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. She wasn't just an innocent woman caught in their web. She was a force they couldn't begin to comprehend. And when the time was right, the truth would come out. And when it did, it wouldn't just exonerate her. It would expose a corruption so deep it would shake the city to its core. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the crowded booking area. Aisha kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed, even as the officers led her through the motions. She felt the curious eyes of other detainees and officers on her but paid them no mind. Years of training had taught her how to control every detail of her appearance, every flicker of emotion. Inside, though, she was calculating. Every word spoken, every movement, every interaction was being catalogued and analyzed. Stevens leaned against the counter as Tanner filled out the paperwork. "So, Miss Collins," he said, dragging out her name like a taunt, "what's a hard-working mom like you doing with drugs near your apartment, huh? Doesn't really fit the PTA image." Aisha turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. She could see the arrogance there, the smug confidence of a man who believed he held all the power. "I don't know what you're trying to imply, officer," she said evenly, "but I have nothing to do with whatever you think you found." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a tough one, aren't you? We'll see how long that lasts." Tanner glanced up briefly, then back down at the paperwork. He seemed less comfortable than Stevens, more nervous. Aisha filed that away for later. People like Tanner were often the weak link in situations like this, eager to prove themselves but unable to handle the pressure when things started to unravel. As the booking process continued, Aisha replayed the night's events in her mind, searching for any details she might have missed. The planted evidence was sloppy, too convenient, too easily tied to her apartment. Whoever was behind this wasn't particularly careful, but they were confident that they wouldn't need to be. It wasn't just about her, she realized. It was about control, sending a message. She had a feeling Stevens and Tanner weren't acting alone. Aisha's thoughts turned to Jamal. Her heart tightened at the thought of her son alone in their apartment, wondering where she was. She trusted him to be strong. He always was, but he was only 10 years old. The thought fueled her resolve. She couldn't afford to let the situation spiral any further. They led her to a holding cell, its cold, grey walls echoing with the faint sounds of distant conversations and the occasional clang of metal. Aisha stepped inside without resistance, glancing around at the other women already seated on the bench. Most of them avoided eye contact, their faces weary and resigned. Aisha chose a spot in the corner, leaning back against the wall as she observed the room. Hours passed, though Aisha barely noticed. Her mind was a hive of activity, piecing together the bigger picture. The precinct itself was a puzzle. She'd been stationed in the city long enough to know the key players, and Stevens didn't strike her as the mastermind type. If this was part of a larger operation, she needed to figure out who was pulling the strings and why they'd targeted her. By the time the morning light began to filter through the small, barred window, Aisha had mapped out several possibilities. She wasn't just dealing with a bad cop and his overeager partner. This went deeper, and it was no coincidence they'd chosen her. Collins, a voice barked from outside the cell. An officer she didn't recognize stood with a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "You've got a visitor." Aisha raised an eyebrow, her mind racing. She hadn't called anyone, and her contacts at the agency wouldn't blow her cover unless it was an emergency. As she followed the officer to a small, stark visitation room, she braced herself for whatever came next. The man waiting for her on the other side of the glass was not who she expected. He was older, with sharp features and an air of authority that was hard to miss. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted. He didn't look like a lawyer or a cop. He looked like someone who was used to being in charge. "Aisha Collins," he said, his voice smooth and measured as she picked up the receiver on her side of the glass. "Or shall I say Agent Collins?" Her heart skipped a beat, but her expression didn't waver. "You've got the wrong person," she said coolly. The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Let's not waste time," he said. "You and I both know that's not true. The question is, why would someone like you end up here, in this situation?" Aisha didn't respond immediately. She studied him, looking for any tells that might give her a clue about who he was and what he wanted. His calm demeanor suggested he wasn't here to harm her, at least not directly. "You seem to know a lot about me," she said finally. "Why don't you tell me who you are?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm someone who can help you, but only if you're willing to help me. This little stunt with the police, it's just the beginning. You've stepped into a game far bigger than you realize." Aisha's mind raced. She couldn't trust him. She knew better than to trust anyone who showed up unannounced, claiming to have answers. But she also couldn't ignore the implications of his words. "What's your angle?" she asked. "My angle," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is survival. Yours, mine, and anyone else caught in the crossfire. You've made some powerful enemies, Agent Collins, and they won't stop until you're silenced. Permanently." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Aisha's grip on the receiver tightened. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. Her quiet, undercover life was over. The man stood, straightening his jacket. "Think about what I've said," he said. "You'll see me again soon." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with more questions than answers. As she was led back to the holding cell, Aisha's mind churned. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. One thing was certain, though: whatever was happening, it wasn't just about her. It was bigger, more dangerous, and far more personal than she'd initially realized. She sat back down on the cold bench, a resolve hardening. She couldn't afford to be a pawn in someone else's game. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, but she wouldn't fight on their terms. For now, she'd wait, she'd watch, and when the time was right, she'd strike back. The hours dragged by in the cold cell, but Aisha wasn't idle. Her mind worked tirelessly, analyzing every moment since her arrest and every word spoken by the mysterious visitor. The stakes were higher than she'd imagined. Someone had orchestrated this, but for what purpose? And how much did they truly know about her? As the other women in the cell slept or kept to themselves, Aisha remained alert, every instinct honed from years in the field, keeping her ready for what might come next. By mid-afternoon, the cell door clanged open, and a guard barked her name. Aisha rose without hesitation, her movements calm but deliberate. They led her back to the main booking area where Stevens and Tanner were waiting. Stevens leaned against the desk, the same smug grin plastered on his face, but Tanner looked uneasy, his eyes darting toward Aisha before quickly looking away. "Seems like your luck's run out," Stevens said, holding up a file. "The evidence is solid, and you're looking at some serious charges. Unless, of course, you like to make things easier on yourself." Aisha tilted her head slightly, feigning confusion. "And how would I do that, officer?" "Cooperate," Stevens said, stepping closer. "Tell us who you're working with. Help us out, and maybe we can work something out for you." She stared at him, unblinking, her face a mask of calm. "I'm not working with anyone, and I have nothing to confess." Stevens' grin faltered just for a second before he recovered. "Suit yourself, but don't say we didn't give you a chance." As they prepared to move her back to the cell, Tanner's voice cut through the tension. "Hold on," he said, his tone uncertain. "Shouldn't we wait for the DA to review this? Something about the timing here doesn't sit right." Stevens shot him a sharp look, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't question me, Tanner." "Got it." Tanner hesitated, then nodded, his discomfort evident. Aisha didn't miss the exchange. It confirmed her earlier suspicion. Tanner wasn't fully on board with whatever plan Stevens had in mind. That crack in their dynamic might be her way out. Later that evening, as the station grew quieter, Aisha's mind returned to the man who had visited her. His warning echoed in her thoughts, each word a riddle she couldn't ignore. Powerful enemies, a bigger game, survival. He'd implied that her situation wasn't random, that she'd been targeted deliberately. But why? Her cover was airtight, her presence in the city carefully planned to avoid detection. Had she missed something, or had someone inside the agency betrayed her? Meanwhile, across town, a different story was unfolding. Malik, the cashier from the corner store, sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone. He'd spent the entire day replaying the scene outside the store, the patrol car, the officers, Aisha's calm yet firm demeanor. Something about the whole situation didn't add up. Malik had grown up in the neighborhood. He knew how things worked. People like Aisha didn't get involved in drugs or crime. She kept to herself, worked hard, and always treated people with kindness. Whatever the cops thought they had on her, he didn't believe it. Malik hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. He'd seen Stevens around before, heard whispers about the officer's questionable methods, but speaking up came with risks. In neighborhoods like theirs, the wrong move could put a target on your back. Still, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that staying silent would be worse. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name. An old friend who worked as a paralegal downtown. Maybe they could help him figure out what to do next. Back at the station, Aisha was finally left alone in an interrogation room, a cup of cold coffee sitting untouched on the table. She used the solitude to assess her options. Her training had prepared her for situations like this: captivity, false accusations, psychological pressure. But this wasn't just about her survival. If her cover was blown, it could jeopardize the entire mission and everyone connected to it. The stakes weren't just personal, they were national. As she mulled over her next move, the door creaked open, and a woman in a crisp suit entered. She was sharp-eyed and confident, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Agent Collins," she said, her voice low but firm. "We don't have much time." Aisha's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed a thin file on the table and opened it, revealing photos, documents, and a map of the city marked with red pins. "I'm here to help you, but you need to trust me. Your cover's been compromised. Someone inside the agency has been feeding information to the very people you're here to investigate." Aisha leaned back, her pulse quickening. "And I'm supposed to take your word for it?" The woman slid a photo across the table, a grainy surveillance image of Stevens meeting with a man Aisha recognized as a known associate of the criminal organization she'd been tracking. "You don't have to take my word for it. The proof is right in front of you." The revelation hit Aisha like a punch to the gut. Stevens wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was actively working with the people she'd been sent to dismantle. And if what this woman said was true, her entire mission had been compromised from the inside. Before Aisha could respond, the woman stood. "You'll be released soon. When you are, find a way to reach me." She slid a card across the table with nothing but a phone number on it. "Be careful who you trust. They're watching your every move." The door closed behind her, leaving Aisha alone with the evidence and more questions than answers. She picked up the card, turning it over in her hand as the weight of the situation settled over her. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. For the first time since her arrest, Aisha felt a flicker of unease. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore. She was fighting to uncover a conspiracy that could cost countless lives, and she was running out of time.